Okay, I hope I'm audible to all students who are attending this lecture of introductory microeconomics. Okay, we continue with our lectures on consumer theory. Okay, formally, this is chapter 21 of the book I prefer to follow for this course, which is Gregory and Mankiw. And the edition I prefer to follow is the 4th edition for my lectures on the introductory microeconomics course. Okay, now in the previous lecture of consumer theory, we had looked at the impact of changes in income and changes in price on the optimal choice of the consumer. We had seen what happens to the optimal choice when income of the consumer changes, and we had also looked at the case as to what happens to the optimal choice when price of one of the good changes, keeping the price of other good and income constant. Now, in this particular lecture, we intend to look at one of the most important concept in consumer theory. What are we trying to do now? We are trying to bifurcate the total price effect. We are trying to bifurcate the total price effect into two effects. One is called the substitution effect. One is called the substitution effect, and another effect is called the income effect. Okay, so we are bifurcating the total price effect into two parts, which are the substitution effect and the income effect. Okay, now let us understand what is meant by substitution effect, what is meant by income effect. So to understand that, we need to understand when price of good X changes, when price of good X changes, okay, keeping price of good Y, keeping price of good Y and income constant, when price of good X changes, keeping price of good Y and income constant, two things happen. So price of good X we can denote by PX, price of good Y we can denote by PY, and income of the consumer is denoted by M. So guys, let's look at the case. Suppose PX is changing, PY and M are kept constant. Now, two type of forces come into play. One is that relative price changes. Relative price, that is PX by PY, changes. Okay. Suppose I say that price of good X falls. What will happen when price of good X falls? Relative to good Y, price of good X has become cheaper. So consumers would prefer to buy, consumers would want to buy more of it and less of good Y. Similarly, if price of good X rises, good X becomes more expensive relative to good Y. So consumers would be now willing to buy less of good X. Okay, so this is one change. Another thing is my purchasing power. So how do we capture purchasing power? Purchasing power in this particular case, which price is changing? Price of good X. So purchasing power in this case is my income divided by my price of the commodity which is changing. So in this case, our purchasing power is M by PX. So purchasing power also changes. So we need to understand when price of good X changes, keeping price of good Y and income constant, there are two forces which are coming into play. One is that when price of good X is changing, relative price is changing. So within this, we have the following case, case 1. If Px falls, it implies that my relative price falls. This implies good X becomes relatively cheaper. Good X becomes relatively cheaper, which implies quantity demanded of good X goes up and quantity demanded of good Y falls. Second case, if price of good X rises, our relative price ratio is going to go up. This implies good X becomes relatively expensive. The word relatively is very important because everything is in comparison to good Y. So good X becomes relatively expensive, which implies now quantity demanded of good X falls and demand for good Y goes up. Okay, so this is the case of relative price changes. This is the case of relative price changes. Okay, now let's look at the purchasing power changes. So within this, let's look at the case. So case 1, if price of good X falls, your purchasing power is going to go up because purchasing power is M upon Px. If our Px falls, my purchasing power is going to go up. So M by Px purchasing power goes up. If your purchasing power goes up, you can now buy more of good X and good Y. If your real purchasing power has gone up, you can buy more of good X also. You can buy more of good Y also. And let's look at the second case. If price of good X rises, our purchasing power will fall, M by Px will fall. And if your purchasing power has fallen, what does purchasing power capture? It captures with your limited income how much commodities you can buy. Okay, so the purchasing power will capture with your constrained or given income how many units of a commodity you can buy. So purchasing power is measured in units. It is measured in real terms. Okay, so if good X becomes more expensive, your purchasing power has fallen. That means in real term you can now buy less. And if your purchasing power has fallen, it means you can buy now less of both. Qx and Qy both will fall. So hoping that students have understood this. When relative price changes, we can have these two cases into force. And when purchasing power changes, when price of good X falls, purchasing power goes up. An increase in purchasing power allows the consumer to consume more of good X and good Y. On the other hand, when Px goes up, then good X becomes more expensive, purchasing power goes down. A fall in the purchasing power causes a fall in the quantity of good X and good Y both. So Qx also falls and Qy also falls. Now we are in a position to describe what is substitution effect and what is income effect. So erasing all this, let us now look at what is meant by substitution effect. So substitution effect captures the change in demand. Substitution effect captures the change in demand when relative price changes, when relative price, which is Px by Py, when the relative price changes, keeping the purchasing power constant. Keeping the purchasing power, which in our case is nothing but M by Px constant. Okay, so let me not write M by Px because it can be M by Py also. So let me just use the term purchasing power. Students know what is meant by purchasing power. If price of good X is changing, purchasing power will be captured by M by Px. If price of good Y is changing, purchasing power will be captured by M by Py. Okay, so substitution effect will capture the change in demand or the change in optimal choice when relative prices will change, keeping the purchasing power constant. Income effect captures the change in demand. Income effect captures the change in demand when purchasing power changes, when purchasing power changes, keeping the price ratio fixed, or I can say keeping the relative price fixed. Keeping the relative price. How do we measure relative price? Px by Py. Keeping the relative price fixed. So when we talk about the substitution effect, that is going to capture change in optimal choice or change in demand when the relative price ratio changes, keeping the purchasing power constant. Income effect will do the opposite. It will capture the change in optimal choice or demand when purchasing power will change, keeping the relative price fixed. Okay, now all students can draw this table. Okay, so table explaining the substitution effect and income effect. Let's all draw this table explaining the substitution effect and the income effect. Okay, so let's look at this table. Now, what we are doing, let's look at the following cases. Let's look at the following cases. We have price effect. We have the price effect. Then we have the substitution effect. Then we have the substitution effect. Then we have the income effect. And then we have the conclusion. Okay, so let's analyze this table, guys. Let's analyze this table. So the case I am analyzing, so I am doing the cases for price of good X falling when PY and income are constant. Let's look at the case when price of good X falls, price of good Y and income are kept constant. So case 1, both good X and good Y, both good X and good Y are normal goods. Now normal goods have a direct relationship with income. When your income goes up, or I can say that normal goods have a direct relationship with purchasing power. When your income goes up or when your real purchasing power goes up, you start buying more of normal goods. Okay, so both good X and good Y are normal goods. Now, when price of good X falls, what will happen, guys? When price of good X falls, when price of good X falls, what will be the substitution effect? What will be the first thought which will come to the consumer's mind? Price of good X has fallen, good X has become relatively more cheaper, buy more of good X and less of good Y. This is the first thought which will come to our mind. And substitution effect captures the relative price changes. When price of good X falls, relative price Px by Py changes. What will the consumer think? Good X has now become cheaper. Let me buy more of good X and less of good Y. So Qx will go up, Qy will fall. What will be the income effect, guys? Now let's look at the purchasing power. Now let's keep relative price aside. When price of good X falls, what happens to purchasing power? What is my purchasing power? M by Px. When Px falls, M upon Px goes up, the purchasing power goes up. That means you can now buy more of good X and more of good Y. So conclusion, what is my conclusion? Price effect is exactly equal to substitution effect plus the income effect, right? Price effect is equal to substitution effect plus income effect. This is my price effect PE. This is my substitution effect SE, and income effect I write as YE. According to, if you look at the conclusion, you can see by substitution effect also good X is rising. By income effect also good X is rising. So in my conclusion, price effect is the sum of substitution effect and income effect. If good X is rising by both the effects in totality also, my good X will rise. But guys, if you look at good Y is falling, quantity of good Y is falling according to the substitution effect. Quantity of good Y is rising according to the income effect. So now I can say that Qy will rise, fall, or remain constant depending on which effect is stronger. Depending on which effect is stronger. So I can say that my Qy is ambiguous in this case, because according to the substitution effect, Qy is falling. According to the income effect, Qy is rising. So in the net result, what will happen depends on which effect is stronger. If substitution effect is stronger than income effect, Qy will fall. If income effect is stronger than substitution effect, Qy will rise. If substitution effect exactly equals the income effect, Qy will remain unchanged. Clear? So I hope all students are clear with the first case. So you can see unambiguously QX will rise. That means when PX falls, QX will rise by substitution effect also, QX will rise by income effect also. So what can I say? In this case, I can say that my demand curve for good X is downward sloping. Demand curve for good X is downward sloping. So when good X and good Y both are normal goods, and when price of good X falls, by substitution effect also good X is rising, by income effect also good X is rising. Price effect is the sum of substitution effect and income effect. So by price effect, when price of good X falls, quantity of good X rises. That means there is inverse relationship between price and quantity. That means the demand curve for good X is downward sloping. Now guys, in this lecture, you will learn how do we derive the demand curve. Till now in our introductory microeconomics course, we just spoke that demand curve is downward sloping, end of story. But in this lecture, you will learn how do we derive the demand curve. Demand curve is derived using substitution effect and income effect. That is why this lecture is one of the most crucial lectures of consumer theory. Because in this lecture, you will be learning how you actually derive the demand curve. And you can clearly see we have already done one case. When both the goods are normal goods, and when price of good X falls, by substitution effect, it becomes relatively more cheap. You buy more of it, less of the other good. By income effect, your purchasing power goes up, you buy more of both. So good Y we are not interested in looking at because good Y is ambiguous. It will rise, fall, or remain constant depending on which effect is stronger. But we are getting a clear-cut answer for good X. By substitution effect also good X is rising. By income effect also good X is rising. That means if you talk about price effect, it's the sum of SE and YE. That means when PX falls, QX is rising. That means there is inverse relationship between price and quantity. That means demand curve for good X is downward slope. So hoping all students have understood this case, okay, and have no doubts. Okay, now guys, let's look at the second case. So I am erasing all this off. Case 1 is done. Let's look at the second case. Let's look at the second case. So erasing all this. Okay, so second case, case 2. Case 2, when good X is inferior good, when good X is inferior and good Y is normal. When good X is inferior and good Y is normal and price of good X falls. Price of good X is falling. Now guys, will there be any change in the substitution effect? No. Always remember, substitution effect will always remain the same. Very simple. Good X has become more cheaper. What thought will come to your mind? Good X has become more cheaper. Let me buy more of it. Let me buy less of the other good. Substitution effect has nothing to do with income or purchasing power. Substitution effect is only to do with the changes in PX by PY, the relative price changes. Good X price has fallen, good X has become more cheaper, buy more of it, less of the other. But now what will be the income effect? When price of good X falls, purchasing power has gone up. Now purchasing power has gone up, but good X is inferior. So you will buy less of the inferior good, but good Y is normal and your purchasing power has gone up. You will buy more of good Y. So I hope students have understood the change from case 1 to case 2. You can clearly see there is no change in substitution effect. That remains the same. But if you clearly observe the income effect, when price of good X falls, purchasing power has gone up. When your purchasing power has gone up, and you can see that good X is inferior, but good Y is normal, you will want to spend more on buying the normal good and less on buying the inferior good. That means when your purchasing power goes up, you buy more of normal but less of inferior. Now let's combine the two effects. Let's combine the two effects. So guys, if you look at, let's first talk about QI. If you talk about QI, QI is again ambiguous. QI is ambiguous. It will fall, rise, or remain constant depending on which effect is stronger. Depending on which effect is stronger. So actually, when price of good X is changing, guys, we are not actually much concerned about good Y. Okay, we are more concerned about good X when price of good X is changing. Okay, now if you look at good X, now all of us know that demand curve for inferior goods is downward sloping. I hope all students agree with me on that. Demand curve for good X is downward sloping. That means when price of good X falls, in totality, quantity demanded of good X should rise. We know the answer, right? Demand curve for inferior goods has to be downward sloping. That means when price of good X falls, in totality, quantity of good X should rise. Now, when will quantity of good X rise in totality? Quantity of good X will rise in totality only when the substitution effect dominates the income effect. Because according to substitution effect, good X should rise, but according to income effect, good X should fall. But our conclusion has to be that good X should rise because demand curve for inferior goods is downward sloping, which means when price of good X is falling, I should get my answer as quantity of good X rising. Now, when will quantity of good X rise? When substitution effect dominates the income effect. So I can say for inferior goods, the substitution effect will always dominate the income effect. So what you have learned is when one of the goods is an inferior good and price of that good falls, in totality, quantity of that good will rise because the substitution effect is going to dominate the income effect. And only when substitution effect dominates the income effect, you can have QX rising. So I can say my conclusion, demand curve for inferior goods, is downward sloping. Demand curve for inferior goods is downward sloping. So I hope students have understood this case. Okay, and now let's look at the next case. So erasing all this off, this is the third case we are looking at. Okay, so erasing all this, let's now look at the third case. Okay, so now guys, our third case is as follows. When good X is a Jiffen good, okay, when good X is a Jiffen good and good Y is normal good. Good X is Jiffen, good Y is a normal good, and price of good X falls. Now, first of all students please recall what is meant by a Jiffen good. We had done this in the first initial lectures of our introductory microeconomics course. Jiffen goods are extreme cases of inferior goods. I repeat, Jiffen goods are extreme cases of inferior goods. Like they are the worst goods among the inferior goods. I can say Jiffen goods are the worst goods among the inferior goods. So again, guys, when price of a Jiffen good falls, again, will the substitution effect change? No, because substitution effect purely relies on the relative price changes. It has nothing to do with income. It has nothing to do with purchasing power. It has only to do with the relative price change. Good X is a Jiffen good, no issue. It has become cheaper. Let me buy more of it. Let me buy less of the other good. Substitution effect purely relies on relative price changes. Good X has become cheaper. Let me buy more of it. Let me buy less of the other good. But what will be the income effect? Price of a Jiffen good has fallen. That means purchasing power has gone up. Purchasing power has gone up, but good X is a Jiffen good. It's the worst among the inferior goods. Will you spend your purchasing power in buying more of Jiffen good? No. That means QX will fall, but good Y is a normal good. Your purchasing power has gone up. You will buy more of the normal. So all you need to do, students, you need to follow the logic. According to substitution effect, good X has become cheaper, buy more of it, buy less of the other good. According to income effect, when price of good X falls, purchasing power, which is captured by M upon Px, when your Px, which is your denominator, has fallen, M by Px, the whole term has gone up. If when your purchasing power has gone up, you would want to buy more of the normal, less of the Jiffen. Now, guys, let's look at the conclusion. Because price effect is the sum of substitution effect and income effect. Now again, can you say anything about QI? No, because QI is falling according to substitution effect and rising according to income effect. So I can say QI will fall, rise, or remain constant depending on which effect is stronger. Depending on which effect is stronger. And we are not much interested in looking at QI. When price of good X changes, we are more interested in looking at good X. So now all students know that Jiffen goods is an exception where the demand curve is upward sloping. If you all can recall from the initial lectures of introductory microeconomics, okay, one of the case where the demand curve becomes upward sloping is when the good is a Jiffen good. So Jiffen goods violate the law of demand. I can write a note. Jiffen goods violate the law of demand. Usually in the normal case, the demand curve is downward sloping. Lower price implies higher quantity demanded. But Jiffen goods are a special case in which the demand curve becomes upward sloping. That means, guys, in case of different goods, price and quantity are moving in the same direction. So we know the answer. When price of good X falls, in net result, my quantity of good X should also fall. That means law of demand states that price and demand move in opposite directions. But different goods is a special case where price and demand are moving in the same direction, which causes the demand curve to be upward sloping. Now, in this case, when price of good X is falling, I know my answer. My quantity of good X should also fall. And when will quantity of good X falls? When income effect dominates the substitution effect. In my net result, quantity of good X will fall when income effect dominates the substitution effect. So guys, I can say when one of the goods is a different good, the income effect for that good will dominate the substitution effect for that good. So I can say in this case, demand curve for good X is upward sloping. Demand curve for good X is upward sloping. Why upward sloping? Because price and quantity are moving in the same direction. When price is falling, quantity demanded is also falling. So I hope students have understood all these three cases. This was, I repeat, this was the third case. This was the third case. So what we have learned is when good X and good Y both are normal and price of good X falls, quantity of good X will rise by both substitution effect and income effect. When good X is inferior and good Y is normal, substitution effect will dominate the income effect for good X, causing the quantity demanded of good X to rise. Hence, the demand curve for inferior goods is downward sloping. But when good X is a different good and good Y is a normal good, in that case, income effect will dominate the substitution effect for good X. So that when price of good X falls, quantity demanded of good X will also fall, which will cause the demand curve for good X to be upward sloping when it is a different good. So I hope students have understood this. And now, guys, what we can do, we can quickly draw diagrams. Now we can draw diagrams to illustrate these cases. So let's look at the diagrams. Okay, so I'm drawing the diagram for all students. So in order to do that, let's erase the irrelevant portion. So let me erase all this now. We are now coming up with the diagrams. Okay, we are now coming up with the diagram. So I can now, to make the diagram, I can write in one column itself. We are taking the case, guys. Let's go back to case one. Case one was when good X is a normal good and good Y is a normal good and price of good X is falling. So price effect, you can recall it's equal to substitution effect plus income effect. Quickly recall when price of good X falls, according to substitution effect, QX should rise, QY should fall. And according to income effect, when price of good X falls, purchasing power goes up. Both of them are normal goods, you buy more of them. Now I can quickly show you the diagram for this case. Now in this diagram, I'm going to show all students how we can bifurcate the price effect into substitution effect and income effect. So let's look at the diagram. So on your screens, you can see we have the horizontal axis. Good X is measured on the horizontal axis and good Y is measured on the vertical axis. Step one, always draw all the budget lines first. First, we draw all the budget lines. Okay. So our initial budget line AB. Okay. When price of good X falls, good X becomes more cheaper. You can now afford to buy more of it. So our budget line shifts from AB to AB1. Now, guys, understand this. Now, how do I capture the substitution effect? Now, look at this very carefully. When price of good X falls, purchasing power that is M by PX goes up. My purchasing power, which is M upon PX, goes up. But to capture the substitution effect, purchasing power has to be kept constant. So I can write this, but to capture the substitution effect, we need to keep purchasing power constant. Now, how will I keep the purchasing power constant? Now, this is the question. How do I keep my purchasing power constant? When price of good X has fallen, my purchasing power has gone up. To make it constant, I will also reduce my income. That means, guys, how do I keep a fraction constant? If my denominator has fallen, to keep M by Px constant, I will also have to reduce my numerator. Only when both numerator and denominator fall by the same proportion, it will cause the fraction to remain constant. This is the basic mathematics. So when price of good X falls, in order to keep the purchasing power constant, I will have to reduce income. Now we are on AB1. Now when I reduce income, what will happen? When I reduce my income, I will come to this brown budget line. Let me call it as the budget line CD. You can see this budget line CD is parallel to the line AB1. So from AB, we went to AB1. But to capture the substitution effect, I had to keep the purchasing power constant. Now, when my PX falls, purchasing power has gone up. To keep it constant, I will have to reduce my income. And when I reduce my income, all of you know what happens to the budget line. It shifts parallelly inwards from AB1 to C. Now we can have the indifference curves. And we are studying the substitution effect, which was given by the economist Hicks. So the substitution effect which we are studying, we are doing the Hicks substitution effect. It was given by the economist John Hicks. Okay, so what did he say? He said that to capture the substitution effect, when price of good X falls, take away that much income from the consumer so that he is on the same indifference curve. I am repeating it, guys. According to Hicks, he says that when price of good X falls, you take away that much income from the consumer so that he is on the same indifference curve. Now we have taken away income from the consumer. Now suppose on the budget line AB, the consumer was consuming at this point. Hypothetically, suppose on the budget line AB, the consumer was consuming at this point. Now on the compensated budget line CD. CD is also called the compensated budget line because we are compensating the consumer. We know that consumers' purchasing power had gone up. We are compensating by taking away income from him so that he is on the same indifference curve. So CD is my compensated budget line. And on CD, where will the consumer consume? Obviously, the consumer will not consume on this segment because the consumer will be worse off. The consumer will consume somewhere here. So that means, guys, both these points should be connected by one indifference curve. Because I repeat, Hicks said that take away that much income from the consumer so that he is on the same indifference curve. That means this point, which is E0, and this point on the budget line CD, which is E1, both these points should lie on the same indifference curve. So I can draw an indifference curve like this. You can see I've drawn an indifference curve. Let me call this as indifference curve I0. You can clearly see initially the consumer was consuming this much amount of X. Now the consumer is consuming this much amount of X. Movement from X0 to X1 denotes the substitution effect. That means, guys, when you are moving from the budget line AB to the budget line CD, your relative price is changing, but your purchasing power is constant. So I can write it in moving from point E0 on the budget line AB to point E1 on the budget line CD, the relative prices have changed. The relative price is nothing but Px by Py has changed, but the purchasing power is constant. Therefore, movement from E0 to E1, denotes the substitution effect. And guys, you can clearly see it is matching our table. When price of good X falls, QX should rise and QY should fall. You can see good X is rising, and if you look at good Y, you can clearly see in moving from E0 to EY, good Y is falling. Although we are not very interested in looking at good Y, but you can see clearly good Y is falling as we are moving from E0 to E1. And then, guys, now how do we capture the income effect? Now, according to Hicks, whatever income was taken away from the consumer to capture the substitution effect, you give the consumer back that income. Very simple. To capture the substitution effect, I had taken away some income from the consumer. So we were on the budget line CD. Now I give that income back to the consumer. Now I am back on the budget line AB1. On the budget line AB1, the consumer should consume more of good X and good Y as compared to E1. Guys, we have reached E1. From E0, we have reached E1. Now from E1, good X should also rise, good Y should also rise. So from E1, we can have a point somewhere here. So you can see the red indifference curve now. You can see when we are moving from E1 to E2, good X is also rising. And when we are moving from E1 to E2, good Y is also rising. So our table is matching. Good X is also rising, good Y is also rising. That means movement from E1 to E2 denotes what? Movement from E1 to E2 denotes the income effect. Movement from E1 to E2 denotes the income effect. And you can clearly see, guys, when we are moving from budget line CD to budget line AB, relative price is the same, because you can see that both these lines AB1 and CD are parallel to each other. You can see AB1 is parallel to the budget line CD. That means both have the same relative prices. But what is changing? Now my purchasing power is changing. So that means I can quickly write in moving from point. So if I erase the irrelevant portion, if I erase only the irrelevant portion and fill up the remaining part. So in moving from point E1 on the budget line CD to E2 on the budget line AB1, the relative prices remain unchanged. The relative prices remain unchanged, but the purchasing power has gone up. But the purchasing power has gone up. Therefore, movement from E1 to E2, movement from E1 to E2 denotes the income effect. Movement from E1 to E2 denotes the income effect. So guys, what we have learned is that movement from E0 to E1 denotes the substitution effect. Movement from E1 to E2 denotes the income effect. You can clearly see, if I talk about good X, by substitution effect also good X is rising, by income effect also good X is rising. And movement from E0 to E2 denotes the price effect. And price effect clearly is the sum of the substitution effect and the income effect. So I hope all students have understood this. And guys, if I quickly draw a demand curve for this, so erasing this part, if I draw the demand curve for good X, now how do I capture the demand curve? You capture the point E0 and point E2, because movement from E0 to E2 is the total price effect. Okay, so I can write it here, E0 to E1 substitution effect. Movement from E1 to E2 is income effect, and movement from E0 to E2 is the total price effect. So if I plot these points E0 and E2 in a graph, this is QX, this is PX. Okay, if I plot the E0 and E2 points, so you can clearly see when my price was high, my initial quantity was X0, and now when my price falls, my new quantity is X2. So when I plot these points, I get the demand curve. So you can clearly see that the demand curve is downward sloping. So this is the demand curve when so initially my price was P0, or I can say PX. When it fell to PX dash, you can clearly see by both substitution effect and income effect, quantity of good X went up. So when price of good X falls, so guys, ultimately to plot the demand curve, we will not look at E1. To plot the demand curve, we will look at the initial point, which is E0, and the final point where we have reached, E2. So this is my combination E0 and this is my combination E2. In moving from E0 to E2, when price of good X falls, ultimately quantity of good X is rising. So demand curve is downward sloping. So hoping that students have understood this and have no doubts. Okay, now guys, let's stop in this particular lecture. Okay, in the next lecture, I will be doing the case when good X is an inferior good and good Y is a normal good, and what happens when good X is a different good and good Y is a normal good. So these two cases, the diagrams for these two cases, we will be doing in the next lecture of introductory microeconomics. Okay, so hoping that all students have enjoyed the lecture and have no doubts. Okay, so this is where I intend to stop in this particular lecture. I hope all students have enjoyed this lecture. Any doubt, you can unmute your mics and ask, or you can call up or mail me your doubts at divineschooloфeconomics@gmail.com. So this is where I stop in this particular lecture.